All right, I'm going to start, if that's okay with everybody. We'll start punctually. Okay, my name is Matthew Billet, as you all know, and for you people at home. And I've elected to write my talk out this time, which is not something I normally do, but I was inspired to do it. I took an anthropology class with Wade Davis here. I don't know if any of you have heard of him. He's an exceptional public speaker, and he writes out all his talks, so I've been inspired to do that. And another part of the reason why I've written it out is because I'm kind of stretching here a bit beyond like my research. So I'm going into some stuff that even challenges me a bit, so I wanted to make sure I wasn't stumbling around the arguments. So, yeah, and for that reason, I hope you all have sympathy if I lack any precision or comprehensiveness. Okay, so let's start. We are in the midst of an ecological crisis marked by a global decline in biodiversity, accelerating acidification of the oceans, widespread degradation of arid lands and freshwater reserves. In more concrete terms, this year we've collectively produced 400 million tons of plastic. We've clear-cut an area of rainforest the size of Germany, and we let 7 million people die from air pollution. Why? As a social scientist, I've been trained to understand our mishandling of the natural environment as a combined failure on the part of our institutions, which can be seen as norms and incentive structures, and of the individual in her beliefs and attitudes, cognitions. So the story goes like this. This is the social science story. It is effortful and costly to go green, right? The incentives are against us. Taking the bus isn't as convenient as driving a car, and disposable consumer goods are often cheaper than their green counterparts. On top of this, our motivational systems just have difficulty processing the reality and the urgency of climate change, right? So we address these failures with interventions that seek to rebalance the scales, right? To stack the cards in the favor of the environment. So we increase incentives for purchasing electric cars. We make recycling less effortful, much easier, with signs at the nest, which everybody obeys and follows, you know. And we launch science communication campaigns to recalibrate people's beliefs. And these certainly work to some degree. I'm not going to argue against that in this talk. But in the story I will tell today, these interventions are only bandages on a beheading. In my story, the ecological crisis is not a crisis of incentives and attitudes. It is actually a crisis of culture. Viewing it in this way turns out to be necessary, I believe, because it reveals challenges to creating a sustainable future that may have not otherwise been visible. And perhaps it even suggests some way forward. But that might be hopeful. We'll see. Okay, so why is this a crisis of culture? Let's start with our basic model from the social sciences. Here we see that people's behaviors are shaped by a combination of the cognitive influences, attitudes, and beliefs, and institutional influences, norms and incentive structures. I guess we could debate if norms are institutional, but I guess by some definitions they are. Implied in this model is the hypothesis that turning the knobs on the cognitive or the institutional factors will influence behavior in the desired direction. And of course this does reflect reality to some degree, but this model is incomplete because what it ignores is that attitudes, beliefs, norms, incentives don't exist in isolation. They don't just float around in society. They're actually embedded in and are products of culturally derived models of reality. Okay, so what is a culturally derived model of reality? Just in the parable of the elephant, the world can be seen to be many different things, right? What the world is relative to people. So these models of realities then are our schemas for the world around us and within us. They give names and therefore they give meaning to relevant features of our environments. Each of us learns how to classify the visible things like family members, strangers, predators, rivers. These aren't intrinsic categories. As well as invisible things like emotions, relationships, supernatural beings, all in accordance with the conceptions of our culture. We learn these things. So our model of reality answers for us the fundamental question of what is, and the meta answer of which is the one given in Genesis 2:19, which is essentially whatever man calls it, it is, right? Models of reality are important because it is in terms of these models that we operate in and seek to change our environment. Moreover, it is in terms of these models that the entire societal edifice is constructed, from our political and legal systems with their assumptions in individual rights and this sort of thing, to those that govern industry and the management of natural resources, which I'll get into a bit here. How a culture answers the question of what is will inform or constrain how that culture answers the question of how to act. So this is the model of reality. As UBC's Wade Davis writes, that's him in the middle smoking something. He writes, was that forest mere cellulose, or was it the domain of spirits, the what is? Those who believed the latter had lived with a very light ecological footprint for several thousand years. My worldview had laid waste to the landscape in less than 2 generations. Okay, so some research I'm currently conducting actually illustrates this principle. It's a bit besides the point, but it's about the apocalypse, so it's kind of fun. When we investigate what people believe about the end of the world, we find that there's 2 subgroups, 2 subcultures. And this is a bit of a simplification, but I hope you'll entertain it. One group believes that the end of the world will supernaturally be caused, and the other believes that it'll be human-caused, anthropogenically caused. Okay, I don't know if you can see this. I don't know if the color's coming out. But the supernatural group tends to be less environmentally concerned, less likely to support environmental policy, and believe that religious activities like faith and prayer will have the greatest effect on the end of the world. The human group, on the other hand, endorses environmentalism to a greater degree and believes things like recycling and reducing carbon footprint will have the greatest effect on the end of the world. So, yeah, I don't know if you can see this, but essentially what you have on the x-axis is the degree of identification with each of these 2 subcultures. And subcultures is just what I'm calling it. So the red line is the supernatural group, and the blue line is the human group. And what you can see is you get this crossover effect. So the greater the degree people split into these models of reality, the greater divergence you'll see in their environmental beliefs and attitudes. So for example, attitudes about the ecological crisis, so like how fragile the earth is, how bad climate change is, that sort of thing. Environmental policy support. And then as well, yeah, this is the recycling and reducing will have the greatest effect on the end of the world. And here you see the reverse effect. It flips over for faith and prayer will have the greatest effect on the end of the world. So essentially, one's environmental attitudes and propensity to engage in environmental behaviors, which are these outcomes, seems to be influenced by one's model of reality, by the answer that one subculture provides to the question of what is the end of the world. Okay. So that's the model of reality. Okay, so what's our culture? What's our cultural model of reality? The ecological crisis is a crisis of culture, of our culture. This is the argument. And many have offered such an argument, claiming at least tacitly that our answer to the question of what is the natural environment and what is our relationship to it is a bad one. Of course, there is no objectively right answer to such a question, but technically speaking, a culture is maladaptive if it functions to make the environment uninhabitable. This is because the survival of a culture depends on the survival of the people, right? It's contingent on the people, and the survival of the people is contingent on the habitability of the environment. And so if people have the goal of survival, and if cultures can be conceived to have the goal of survival, then a model of reality that has environmental degradation as its output is maladaptive. And if you're a pragmatist, maladaptation is falsehood. So I don't know if that means anything to you, if that helps. So this raises the question of what is our model of reality with respect to the natural environment? If I'm to lay the burden of the ecological crisis at the foot of our culture, then what exactly is our culture? This is surely an impossible question to answer in its entirety, so I'll offer 2 arguments to illuminate the issue. 2 arguments that are not mine, so you can't assail me for them. One from a historian and one from an anthropologist. Okay, the historian is Lynn White Jr., who in 1966 offered a provocative perspective on the ecological crisis. White properly attributed the capacity for humanity to destroy the environment, like significantly, to the technological advances of the Industrial Revolution. So the capacity was gained in the Industrial Revolution. But he also argued that our cultural conception of the natural environment was what actualized that capacity. So actualization of the capacity is when the cultural model met the Industrial Revolution. He suggested that the way we conceptualize nature, viewing it as a resource, natural resources, as a means to an end, or as Heidegger put it, as a standing reserve of energy, has its roots in medieval Christianity. This was his argument, which makes sense because he was a historian of medieval Christianity. Okay, so specifically he believed that two doctrines rooted in the story of Genesis were the main culprits. Firstly, he believed the idea of man's dominion over nature normalized the exploitation of nature. I think we hear this a lot in popular press arguments. Secondly, he also believed that the idea that man alone had a monopoly on soul in the natural world, man is made in the image of God, man has soul, that's the image of God. That's what cast away animism. And that allowed us to exploit nature with a mood of indifference. And so that seems pretty damning. So White's view has found controversy in some circles of historians and theologians alike, but it does gesture towards some important features of culture that are worth noting. So one is that cultures evolve over time, and they co-evolve in relation to ecological, socio-political, technological conditions. People evolve to their environment and vice versa. Essentially, that's the point. This is why we have cultural diversity, distributed across geographical space. Another thing to note is that the influence of cultural ideas and doctrines reverberate through societies even many years after its people no longer believe in them, right? They get baked into the culture, they get baked into the institutions, this sort of thing. So it's not inconceivable that the religious beliefs of medieval Christians are still relevant to us today. On the other side of the coin, the anthropologist Roy Rappaport disagreed with some of White's analysis. Rappaport believed the roots of the ecological crisis were to be found in the doctrines of secular thought rather than religious thought. So in particular, he located the issue in economic rationality and something he called the epistemology of money. And this is going to turn out to be pretty significant in this talk. So in modern societies, money is synonymous with value. The power of money lies in its ability to dissolve qualitative differences between things and provide a common currency, technically a common currency, in which unlike things may be compared. It reduces, in this case, or simplifies the world, which is composed of qualitatively unlike things, into a single metric with which these things can be compared. So the value of complexity then is itself lost in translation, or at least it must be measured and accounted for, which is not implied in the method, right? So complexity itself is lost in translation. It takes a backseat to sheer quantity. A rich and biodiverse ecosystem becomes second to the highly valuable coal or cobalt that may lie underneath it, right? And we're only coming around now to the value of biodiversity in and of itself, right? That's kind of a task that we're dealing with now. And I think, as a side note, I think this is kind of, if you look at the hedonism, the history of hedonism, I think they had a similar issue where it was if you believed in the sheer quantity of pleasure defined a good life, you fall into all these traps of just people living these lives that are very impractical and not good to any reasonable observer. And so you had I think it was John Stuart Mill, you're the philosopher, right? John Stuart Mill. Fair enough. Whatever. So he proposed a mixed qualities of pleasure. That's how you get the good life. So they solved that problem, and I think we're still dealing with this in this realm. So the consequence of this, Rappaport argues, is that nature becomes easier to exploit. Its exploitation can more easily be rationally or economically justified. Our economists must demonstrate the monetary value of nature so that its existence can be justified. In our society, you may win the hearts of the people, but scarcely win the favor of the gods by arguing that a plot of land as such is worth preserving without further recourse to its carbon capture ability, to its cultural or aesthetic value, so on, all in dollar terms. This is the argument you have to make to move the needle on any issue these days. So to be clear, I'm going to hedge my bet here. Rappaport does not argue that the cost-benefit analysis is unimportant or doesn't serve vital functions or doesn't fix any vital problems in our society, only that it's not fundamental and that economics is not and ought not be, pragmatically speaking, the ultimate concern of society. Okay. what does this mean and why is this an issue? It's like Alice in Wonderland. Okay, perhaps I've convinced you, perhaps at the very least, to take seriously the role of culture in the current ecological crisis. So if the ecological crisis is a crisis of culture, then surely we need to seek a cultural solution. If turning the knobs on attitudes and incentives only offer incremental and proximal improvements to the current state of affairs, then shouldn't we be searching for an ultimate improvement, for cultural change? Here's the problem. Cultures are hard to change, which turns out to be a good thing in some ways. And manufacturing rapid change in an ethical fashion is difficult. And I don't think we've solved that issue. Specifically, our culture surrounding our relationship with the natural environment will be difficult to change for 3 reasons. And these barriers would not necessarily be visible to us without this cultural lens. Okay, the first barrier to cultural change is time. Models of reality are shaped gradually over long stretches of time through processes of cultural transmission and diffusion, like these population dynamics, environmental feedback, and only in some cases rational inquiry. If you can think about like what Darwin's discovery did to how we conceptualize what it means to be human and our relationship to the natural world, that would be like a consequence of rational inquiry. Within individuals, models of reality are very stable. So perhaps psychological shocks like trauma, psychedelic drugs, or numinous experiences are some of the only ways to change our schemas at this very fundamental level. Science communication or other forms of rational argument then will not cut it. Just try arguing yourself into or out of a religious belief. It's not easy. And it isn't clear in the cases that you are successful that the rational argument isn't just an epiphenomenon of whatever other process led you to conversion, right? Okay, you don't have to get carried away in understanding this, but so if we expand our conception of culture to include the structural and components of culture, like more of the sociological concern, then we'll still arrive at the same problem, which is fundamental change takes time. This is a good thing because from an evolutionary perspective, or from evolutionary logic, structural change possesses more risk than changes just in state. So the risk of premature structural change in response to transient environmental dynamics is a loss of flexibility. And for living systems with its goal of survival in the context of ever-changing environment, flexibility is very valuable. So living systems shouldn't give up flexibility easily. That's why time is a necessary component of cultural change. According to Rappaport, cultural change takes place in 3 progressive stages that gradually shift from changes in state to changes in structure. So first, individuals withdraw their support for an authority or an authority structure. This looks something like demonstration or protest. Second, the validity of the incumbent authority is rejected, so the person who has authority. This is like the case in the resignation of a president or like the exile of a king. And this is still a change in state because no assault on the actual like kingship or presidency itself has been made. But in the third stage they are. The third stage consists of the desanctification, and we'll just leave that word vague, of the authority structure itself, which often requires the use of force or revolt. So the revolution is sanctified, vague, with reference to the ultimate values of society, which were not being served by the previous authority structure. So this is just one way of like, one way you can see this is like the American Revolution was a forceful revolt to instill a new authority structure that served the ultimate goals of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. That's kind of cultural change example. Deep change takes time. Okay, so the second barrier to cultural change is that it depends on a functioning feedback system, one that isn't reflected in our current state of affairs. So culture is contingent on people, like I said, and people are contingent on their environment. So behaviors that make our environment less habitable are maladaptive by definition. So the stages of cultural change depend on people receiving feedback from the environment that their behaviors are having a negative effect. They're maladaptive, right? It's not obvious to us that when we do things, they're bad for us. So we need feedback. So imagine you're living in a beautiful village, and in this village, we overlogged our forest because we wanted to construct a bunch of homes. We wanted to grow, we valued growth. we'd be out of firewood for the winter, right? So we wouldn't have any more wood. It would be all be in our houses. So we overtaxed our common pool of timber. So the stress of that winter is important information that needs to be fed back into the regulatory system, which is the management of our resources was bad, and life is difficult now. Enough time in this state would evoke changes in authority structure or in our culture. So people would first be irritated and express their irritation, which is stage 1, a demonstration. Leaders would be swapped out, stage 2, and if no leader could manage our resources effectively, then perhaps a reevaluation of the system would be warranted, stage 3. Perhaps people would leave and go to another society, or perhaps it would weaken the society to a degree where it would be overtaken or infused with the ideas of another culture, depending on, socio-political context. So that sounds reasonable. Society should be sensitive to the environment and be able to adapt when needed. Unfortunately, our situation is quite different. The more we destroy nature, the better our lives get, at least for now. As long as we occupy this paradox and our maladaptive behaviors experience this flourishing, then the process of cultural change will continue to be impeded. So that's the second barrier. The third barrier is power. And this is perhaps the most intractable one. And it's perhaps the one I least know about. So we'll deal with it briefly. Imagine society to be like a human body. The human, holistically at the highest level, has as its goal survival. We've been using this evolutionary framework, or this metaphor even. The human body is composed of organs, subsystems. It has this levels of organization. And as you get lower in these levels of organization, these subsystems have more and more specific goals, So like regulating the pH of the stomach or maintaining temperature in the body or something like that. Not survival, more specific outputs. So the specific goals of the organs in an adaptive system, one that's functioning correctly, should be subordinate to the ultimate goal of the organism. So sometimes we need to have a fever if we want to get rid of a virus. If the specific goal of temperature regulation was elevated above the general goal of survival, then we would die. So it would be maladaptive. This is a bad system. So a hierarchy of goals, organized from the most general at the top to the most specific at the bottom, is required for the proper functioning of any self-regulating system. In highly sectorial societies like ours, there's a risk that the specific goals that govern a given sector, so education, media, finance, will become elevated to a position of predominance above the general goal of survival. The individuals that participate in specific sectors may identify with their sector, taking its specific goals and outputs to constitute their own personal goals. They identify with their occupation, as many of you might understand. And those sectors that are most endowed with power, so industrial firms, financial firms, the military, they have the resources to make this happen. So they have the ability to elevate the goals of their sector to societal predominance. And some would argue that this is the case in our society. So lobbyists buy policy in our democratic society, right? This is power. And as Rappaport notes, the average American may have internalized the specific goals of business, which is profit, private enterprise, and consumption, which are fine goals for a subsystem. They may have conflated these with the more proper ultimate concerns, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, in the American example. So power allows subsystems to transcend the regulatory structures that keep them in check, that ensure they continue to serve the ultimate goals of society, which in the final analysis is to persist. Power, therefore, is a major barrier for cultural change, because we need a regulatory structure that functions to have change. Okay, this is the final section. What can be done? Okay, let's take a recap. So I've proposed that culture is a key player in the ecological crisis, offered some ways of looking at culture, within people and across societies as models of reality and as regulatory structures. I've discussed some reasons why scholars say our culture is maladaptive with respect to the environment, and I've discussed why changing these conceptions are difficult. So at this point, I have to offer some sort of, solution. So I have two ideas on this. Okay, so one solution is to bypass cultural change entirely, along with its complexities and difficulties. So instead of seeking fundamental cultural change, it may be more practical to defer to cultures that have the tools to confront the issues of environmental management. Pluralism. If we do not have the tools to justify the preservation of nature, then perhaps it's better to leave it in the hands of people who do. And Canadians and the Canadian government seem to be prepared to do this, and there's some examples of this. So I like to use the case of Jumbo Mountain to illustrate this argument. Jumbo Mountain is in the Rocky Mountain region in British Columbia, the East Kootenay region. And the mountain is crowned by this glacier complex. There's 3 glaciers at the top that are so incredible that one may imagine them to be the site of a great spirit whose residence dates back millennia. Or perhaps one may imagine it to be the site of the world's most legendary skiing. In fact, as it happens, this is the exact premise of a 3 decades-long legal dispute for the rights to Jumbo Mountain. Wild coincidence, you know. Okay, on one side of the dispute is Glacier Ski Resorts Limited, a corporate conglomerate that has secured the rights to construct a $1 billion luxury ski resort on Jumbo Mountain. And in their words, in this $1 billion proposal, the skiing will be quite literally legendary. So, on the other side of the dispute is the Ktunaxa Nation, the people indigenous to the region who seek to protect Jumbo Mountain, which is known to them as Katmuk, the home of the grizzly bear spirit. So this dispute is not strictly economic, not strictly legal. In fact, the Glacier Ski Resort has the economic argument and the legal argument on their side. But actually this is a clash of cultures. It's a clash of models of reality. The Ktunaxa conceptualized the natural environment in quite a different way than the individuals that manage glacier resorts. So to the Ktunaxa, Jumbo Mountain is both nature and spirit. It is where grizzly bear spirit was born and resides, and at the same time it is home to a population of flesh and blood grizzly bears. Through the people, the grizzly bears are given a voice. Through the grizzly bear spirit is given life, and through the grizzly bear spirit, the people are given guidance and protection. So all beings are interconnected. Their survival, organically and spiritually, are dependent on each other. This web of life idea that people have heard about. So Katmuk, or Jumbo Mountain then, is a sort of sacred fulcrum on which the delicate balance between the spiritual and the organic rests. So we have this other element here, the spiritual element, which is not accounted for in the epistemology of money, you know. Okay, so to build something as invasive as a ski resort on Jumbo Mountain would be to disrupt the peace of the grizzly bear spirit. No amount of economic prosperity can justify disrupting the spirit. It's a trump card, right? Because the Ktunaxa's spiritual beliefs are not a function of the epistemology of money. Spiritual harmony is incommensurate with, and it's not reducible to dollar terms. It's something actually different, and it's something higher in the hierarchy of values for them. The ultimate concern of the Ktunaxa is not economic, it's not material, but it's transcendent. Or immanent. It's immanent, actually. So this is the proposed plans for the ski resort. I don't know. It would be a massive ski resort. Glacier resorts do not share the same model of reality. They obey the epistemology of money and have as their goal the maximization of profit. As they should, because they're an operative of the economic subsystem, so they should have these goals that guide them. To them, Jumbo Mountain is what it can offer to the consumer. It's not nature and spirit simultaneously. It is an instrument. So nature is purely instrumental. Its worth determined by the market, by what people will pay to consume it. Glacier Resorts does not deny that the mountain may have cultural and spiritual significance to the Ktunaxa, only that this value of the spiritual significance can be quantified in dollar terms and justified. It can be paid for in full, right? In the end, though, this clash was a story of hope. Canadians rallied in support of the Ktunaxa, and in early 2020, the government put up over $16 million to secure 70,000 hectares of the Rocky Mountains, including Jumbo Mountain. It became the Purcell, protected, conservation park or something. I forget. It's a big name. So what's significant about this is that most Canadians don't share the spiritual beliefs of the Ktunaxa. They don't believe in grizzly bear spirit. But perhaps they supported the Tunaha because they recognized that their culture was functioning in an adaptive way that was serving their values, when it comes to managing the environment. Canadians were maybe, if I could speak on behalf of Canadians, maybe they were evaluating the outputs, the functional outputs of the Tunaha's culture compared with their own, and they decided that in this case the Tunaha were right, or adaptive. This doesn't require a change in the predominant culture, only the recognition of its misfunctioning, the humility to look outwards, and the honesty to put land back in the hands of those who can better serve it. Okay, so cultural pluralism, and then the second suggestion is this. If one were to take on the Herculean task of cultural change in hopes of addressing the ecological crisis, what must one do? Well, if the goal is to evaluate nature, or to elevate nature to the status of sacred, which in our society may perhaps be defined as that which possesses value subordinate or superordinate to economic value, or that which possesses ultimate or transcendent value, then we must look to the ways by which things become sacred, look to the ways by which things become transcendent or superordinate. One such way is through spiritual significance. So spirituality is not synonymous with religion, though it is an essential part of it. Rather, the formal institutional sociological properties that define religion that make familiar to you are absent from spirituality. You can tease it apart. So spirituality is better defined at the individual level as the appraisal of the divine and the experience with the numinous. These are two terms which I'll define. So the divine is this as supernatural referent. So grizzly bear spirit is divine, right? Supernatural. And the numinous is spiritual experience, which is like awe, wonder, grace, the sublime, these sorts of words. Therefore, nature spirituality, or I call it eco-spirituality, can be understood as both the appraisal of nature's supernatural qualities and the experience of those qualities. So in my own research, I've found eco-spirituality to be a powerful and unique predictor of viewing nature as something sacred. So I'll take a quick dive through this, and that will lead us to the end of the lecture. So we see this in how people make decisions about the preservation of nature. So when people score high on our measure of eco-spirituality, they tend to deprioritize instrumental reasoning about nature, or utilitarianism. You can see the blue and red, right? Yeah? Okay. So they deprioritize utilitarianism, and instead they tend to place a greater importance on ideas about rules, duties, principles of right and wrong, so deontology. And you see this crossover effect where at the high end of the scale, deontology takes on a higher priority. And this is just self-report. We just ask people to rate on a scale what's more important and give them a list of items. This reasoning style is counter to the economic rationality that prioritizes cost-benefit analysis in deciding whether or not nature should be preserved. This preference for deontological reasoning seems to affect people's behavior in decision-making tasks as well, so not just self-report, although I guess there's self-report decision-making tasks. So in one task, we provide information on an upcoming industrial project. It has many economic upsides, some risks to the environment. That's the table here, costs and benefits. We just are asking participants to think in this way. We're inviting them to say, hey, consider the costs and benefits, this sort of utilitarian cost-benefit thing. And then we ask them to indicate how much of the economic benefits, so given at the societal level, so this could be like how many jobs produced in the locale, or how much income or revenue is generated by the project, these sorts of things. And also how much benefit given to them personally, so like tax cuts. How much benefit would justify the construction of the industrial project? To put a price on nature. In other words, that's what we asked them to do. And as you can see, they have this one option here. No amount is acceptable. Right? So this would be the deontological. This would be on principle. I don't want to accept this exercise at all. Right? So what we see is that eco-spirituality significantly and uniquely predicts not just putting a higher price on nature, right? But rejecting the exercise of economic reasoning altogether. So instead, people high in eco-spirituality prefer not to put nature in economic terms, even if favorable terms. And this is a meaningful effect. It's a big sloping line. The average participant scoring at the midpoint of the scale, the eco-spirituality scale, had a roughly 30% chance of refusing to entertain the task to move the slider. while the average participant scoring at the highest end of the scale had a roughly 60% chance of doing that. And so this line is actually derived from a regression that's controlling for how much people identified as an environmentalist. So it's not just caring about the environment, right? It's this kind of spiritual thing. And we also controlled for demographics like age, gender, income, religiosity, that sort of stuff. Because religiosity co-varies with a little bit with spirituality, right? Okay, so spiritualizing nature seems to be one pathway to transcending our predominant mode of economic rationality. But of course, this comes with its own hazards. You know, I'm not naive about this. So for one, and this is just one example, but there's many, the reasoning style associated with sacred values can fall prey to its own cognitive biases. Just like, you know, Kahneman and Tversky talk about biases in rational thought and decision-making and stuff. You can have biases in irrational or non-rational thinking. So one of these examples is quantity insensitivity. So the belief that cutting one tree is as morally reprehensible as cutting 100 trees. And so, you know, this conviction can motivate you to do great acts of environmental preservation, but at the same time, it can derail attempts to compromise. And you know, in the real world, you have to compromise, right? Especially when you're not in the seat of power. So that's a hazard. Okay, but what I find promising about this eco-spirituality thing is that it appeals to something distinctly human, something perhaps universal. That oceanic feeling that Freud wrote about, the personal, subjective, non-institutionalized, unmediated experience with the sacred. You don't need to be from any given race, religion, creed, country to experience the sublime in nature. It's a language understood by anyone who's experienced it or dreamed of it, and perhaps it's a language that can rehabilitate some of the partisan divides over matters of environmental conservation that seems to divide us. They seem to plague us. Okay, so indeed, this is going to be one of the last points. Indeed, in my research, I found eco-spirituality to be common to many participants. So gender, age, socioeconomic status, religion, they don't seem to matter. They don't seem to predict who's eco-spiritual or not. This is true in samples of people, Americans, Canadians, British people, and Singaporeans. From different religions, too. We got religiously diverse samples. Most importantly, unlike other attitudes or beliefs about the environment that we've measured, eco-spirituality is essentially uncorrelated with political orientation, and this is a big deal in America. Preserving the environment should not be a partisan issue, and so perhaps eco-spirituality is the common ground we need to bridge these divides. And so in this graph, the red zone is the conservative zone, and the blue zone is the liberal zone. And you'll see, just on average, people were more liberal in our samples, so eco-spirituality is in the blue zone, but the slope is just flat. And here you have other general attitudes about the, you know, climate change is bad, the earth is fragile, these sorts of things. And you can see that you have this, again, it's like crossing over the midpoint, which is people on different sides of the political spectrum are disagreeing on these items. Okay. The ecological crisis is a crisis of culture. Culture is complicated, but it's what makes us human. It is fundamental. The approach we take to addressing the ecological crisis, then, has implications at this most basic level. If this means learning humility for cultures besides our own, if this means rediscovering and recentering the spiritual in our understanding of the natural world, then perhaps we have some reason to be hopeful. And that's all I have. Thanks. Okay. Yep. Thanks.
I have two questions. One fundamental question and one more emerging question.
Okay.
Which one do you want to hear first?
I don't know.
Fundamental is bio.
The meta question?
The fundamental one.
Fundamental question, okay.
Okay. Yes. This was about the sentence you said about time, and if we are not changing so quickly with time, we are more adaptable. But I feel like it's the opposite, right? We are more adaptable if we, as living beings or so, are faster with change of our environment to also change. This is why I didn't really understand how you meant it.
Yeah.
And I can say one more note to this, but at first I want to see how you respond to my question.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so the distinction here, so the question, maybe, I don't know if the live streamers can hear through that mic, I don't know. But the question is, I said that it's more adaptive from the evolutionary perspective, that a living system does not rapidly change its structure, right? So it's not change in itself that's maladaptive. It's structural change, right? So flexibility comes from a stable structure that allows for flexible changes in state. So you can, like, one example would be like the most adaptive mutation that there is, which is culture itself, like learning, cultural learning. So the structure, like the tools, the faculties that we have that allow us to learn from other people and to choose who to learn from and who to elevate to positions of status, which people then learn from. This structure of cultural learning should be stable, right? It takes a lot to change those sorts of like biological, like neurological things. But what that structure affords us is immense flexibility, right? So from generation to generation, we can totally change our practices, our beliefs, how we operate and interact with the environment. So it's a distinction between state and structure that I'm talking about.
So we went super quickly then to a super high level now again. So I want to quickly say in between, so after your first sentences, I think the structure comes from our plasticity. Our brain and our cells, they are all plastic, so it takes always time to change our living cells we are having. So we are not physics, we are biology. We have even the life part here in it. The life part can only change with time. This is our strength, because we can heal ourselves when we are being hurt. We can also heal ourselves psychologically and so on. But the thing is, the structure is there, but the structure is given by physics, and biology is even changing it. And the quicker it can change the structure, the more adaptable these living beings were in the evolution. So we are crazily adaptable as humans, and this is why we are here and why we are at the top of maybe the species then in the end. And so I'm not fully agreeing with that, but maybe it's a good point. So I think...
Sorry, maybe it's a what?
Yes, maybe it's a good point that we are even crazily adaptable, but the thing is there are many loose parts here. So there are not even these cells in our own body, not even these different mindsets we can have, these different personalities we take throughout the days. But also then, there are these communities of people we are interacting with, families, and then to the city level, many uncoupled kind of beings. They've never talked to each other. And then even on a state level, you haven't met all the people. So you just have to meet them more also, or the internet is combining us more. So I think it's super quick even, the changing of the structure, but you need a push. And this is what you described, I think, by the trauma also, when somebody changes their point of view. And what do you say to this? And then I can come to the emerging question.
I think I agree with like a lot of what you're saying. One thing about like the levels of analysis, right, from going from the individual to the group to higher society is like, I think you're right about this. Like, the larger and more complex and sophisticated, like sociologically, a society becomes, which is mostly a function of just scale, the more those, let's say, like the regulatory and feedback systems that I was talking about, let's say they have to travel more of a distance, like if we're talking the metaphor of like electrical system. Or the bonds between individuals, whatever influence any individual or any group of individuals have, become the subordinate force, if we're talking in a chemical metaphor. So I think that, yeah, scale complicates things, makes things more difficult.
Yes. Nice. And the interaction with the scales and so on, and the time scales and so on. Nice. Okay. So this brings me to the emerging question, and this was the last part of your talk. So the eco-spirituality. It seems like when I've heard this at first, it seems like it's from this capitalist point of view, I think you had with the example. Going to the eco-spirituality, it's again a shift away from the reality, but in a different way.
The shift away from what?
Shift away from the reality.
Okay.
I feel like. Because spirituality is sometimes, I feel like, a shift away from what is really in front of your eyes and what animals are there, and therefore I want to suggest something. And what I want to suggest is that maybe we can create a mindset shift, every single one of us individually, of seeing not only us humans here, but also other animals as just equal species. Also maybe interact with them also on a daily basis even. So maybe looking at the birds or so, maybe seeing the birds, seeing the coyotes whatsoever, and appreciating them, giving them the same respect you would give other people. So this kind of thing, which is not direct spirituality, but it's seeing these living beings in front of us, seeing this is a living thing, and it also has to deal with life and death every day, and has to work, and this work is maybe called hunting, but whatsoever. We are not doing so much different, we are just more collective, and this is why we have specialized then in evolution. So this kind of shift maybe of we are not seeing only our species, we are seeing everything. So a more whole view of the whole world with the plants we need and everything, which is making everything more non-linear, but this would be more whole. And maybe we do feel then also more whole. I don't know. So this would be my take also. This took long.
I think it's a good suggestion, and I think Peter Singer or some of the modern like utilitarians offered like this sort of thing, like decentering the value of the human, like over the rest of the natural world. And some people live by it. It's complicated. I mean, it has its own. Like if you solve one problem with something like that, you have its own problems. But I think that's a nice perspective, and I hope you can work that out, and we can talk about that. It's too complicated to address in this case. So.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Thanks.
No problem.
I have two questions. One is a question and one's a provocation, perhaps.
Okay.
So, question number one: to what? It's on. It's connected to the live stream, right? Yeah. This is connected to the live stream.
Okay.
Okay. So, question one is: to what extent do you think cultural pluralism or other kinds of sort of individual perspectives that can become collective, to what extent do you think they're able to affect change when they run into things like structural economic interests? Like, are you proposing that something like a cultural pluralism can, run up against something like state interests and extraction and affect them in any way? Like the mountain example is a good outcome unless you're someone who like hunts grizzlies and wants to keep doing that. But what happens when it's a pipeline or something? The state's BC's invested economically in skiing, but they're way more invested in something like resource extraction. Yeah, that's question number one.
Yeah. That's a hard issue. I mean, that's why the example is a fun one, because it's like, the legal aspect was on the side of the glacier ski resorts, because there was no rituals practiced on the, so there's no rituals practiced as traditions and customs or whatever the legal jargon is, on the mountain. So they had no recourse to the law that protected that as a sacred site. And the economic interests were clearly on the side of the glacier ski resorts. I mean, it would have been an extremely profitable enterprise over 20 years, right? And so in this case, in this case, the interests of one of our cultures, one of our subcultures, the indigenous people to the land, trump those interests. So I think it's possible, in this example, but I think it's difficult, and there's legal complexities that I don't understand that go into it, and issues of power in that as well. But I think this is like the suggestion of, one of the most powerful arguments we have is the argument of giving indigenous people their land back, right? Because that is kind of the trump card that hopefully we can utilize to solve many issues at once, right? A lot of these issues are intertwined, and so I don't know the law, but I feel like that might be one of the better options to transcend the economic reasoning, which of course serves very vital functions. I'm not arguing against that. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. One more thing, and then I'll give the mic up. This is a provocation that is given to me frequently, so I'm just going to pass it on to you, and then maybe it'll leave me. But you, in your talk, you referenced the idea of a collective we a lot. Who is your we?
Yeah, well, I don't answer that question in the talk.
Yeah.
And I won't answer it now. I mean, in some ways it's rhetorical, and in some ways, I don't know, it's suggestive to the big we that we all have in our minds. I mean,
yeah.
Industrial society, the West, but it's not the West anymore. I mean, it's just developing countries that have industrial interests and need to compete in the global market, I guess. It's just it's everybody now, right?
Yeah.
So it is as vaguely defined as possible, because I think it is like kind of a seriously global and collective issue, because we are in this competitive, cooperative, political mess across the globe, right? So.
Yeah. Cool. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks. I think. Do you have a question? Okay. Sure.
Thank you for the great talk. I am curious, so you mentioned the possibility at the end that eco-spirituality could be universal, and you mentioned the results about the correlation between political climate, political culture versus eco-spirituality. And I am curious I was wondering if you have any more research about it. For instance, political culture is one thing, but for instance, in the previous example, you were talking about this mountain, and I kind of could see that as like the battle or conflict of like capitalism, like as a whole, or like something bigger than just political culture versus indigenous values. So I feel like, if there could be more research about like other aspects of culture and speech, like correlation or uncorrelation between the culture, these other parts of culture versus eco-spirituality, that'd be great.
Right, so does eco-spirituality co-vary with other aspects of culture? I don't think we've put that to the test, really. I mean, we've only ran surveys in Canada, United States, UK, and Singapore. We have a really religiously diverse sample in Singapore. So we talked to Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, Taoists, and non-religious people. And I mean, as far as we can tell, it's not really associated with culture in the way that we're measuring it. But like, there's a lot of caveats here, because we've generated the scale, and it has perhaps baked into it our implicit biases, of being like, what's our conception of eco-spirituality, right? Which is like probably influenced by American transcendentalist like thought, like this sort of thing. So the extent to which people across the world in different cultures agree with our measure, that could be an effect, right? Like some places might, if we did a wide scale, like across the globe, 20, 30, 40 cultures, I'm sure there'd be differences. But does that mean spirituality, especially spiritualizing the natural environment, isn't present in all those cultures, even if they disagree with some items on our scale? I don't think that addresses that question. So, in other words, I think that spirituality seems to be a human universal. People argue that ritual is a human universal. I think one of the first things people would spiritualize is the natural environment, because it's the most pervasive and most powerful. So that's probably universal. I don't have any data on this. But the extent to which different cultures agree with what we're calling eco-spirituality for the sake of measurement, many cultures probably won't agree with what we're calling eco-spirituality. So I don't know if that answers the question. But I'm not sure if I even interpreted your question properly, but...
I'm just more curious just about that research, like what kind of research could be done, what kind of limitations could be out there in order to really, I don't know, assess this argument, because it could be a huge argument. And I'm really hopeful that eco-spirituality could be a key to address this kind of, huge like philosophical conflicts. But at the same time, I'm just curious as a researcher, the research. So but I think I really like your answer. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks. We can talk at like dinner and stuff about the rest
Totally.
of the research.
I'm really interested.
Hi.
Yep.
In general, I'm very sympathetic to your ideas, but I'll go to what I might disagree with because it's more fun.
Okay, good. I'm glad. I want you to.
So, like in the last part of your talk, when you're proposing your solution, you seems to be assuming, to some extent, that the spirituality you appeal to is kind of immune from the economical exploitation. But that seems to be false, at least to some extent, right? Because there are things like, I don't know, Scientology. In Japan you have Happy Science. You have all these cults that are exploiting like the spirituality of people in a kind of economical way, right? Mm. So you might say, okay, that's true. And then I think there are maybe two ways in which one could proceed from your perspective. So you might want to say, okay, well, on the one hand, that might be a problem to your solution. Or you might say, okay, but that's good. We can actually exploit the spirituality of people in a way that it's, well, like economically exploitable, but like good for the environment. Yeah. But that then seems to be a problem for your claim that it's a cultural problem, because that would be a solution within the limits of the culture. Right?
Is this like are you saying that I'm saying we have to change culture, but then at the same time I'm saying that spirituality is a solution, but spirituality isn't changing culture?
I'm saying that if the solution is given by exploiting spirituality in a economical way, then that's a solution within the culture. It's not changing the culture because it's within this, like, I don't know, capitalistic framework, whatever. So the culture is not a problem yet. I mean, the culture is also the solution in that case. Or or you might deny that the exploitation would happen, or that we have a way of making it not happen, and which is what I would like to try to argue, but I'm not sure how to argue that.
Okay, I think that insofar as eco-spirituality, which is like spiritualizing nature, not just spirituality in general, constitutes a cultural solution, is that the degree to which it reconceptualizes what we think nature is, right? So it's adding in, like in the Tunaka's case, the spiritual element back into the organic, right? It's saying, what is Jumbo Mountain? It's not just, whatever its natural resources is, its geological constitution, this sort of thing, its economic potential. It is something immanent or transcendent, right? It is something spiritual. So I think that's comes back to the model of reality bit I was talking about, which is essentially our schemas. What is nature? What is Jumbo Mountain? So I think that I would tie in spirituality with that. And because spirituality is like the experience of those sorts of things, and the construal of those experiences, whatever. It's the construal of those experiences as things that constitute our world, right? So you experience the divine in nature. You go out and you have this crazy experience out in nature, and then you say the divine's in nature, something like this.
When you say that goes like beyond economical exploitation.
You can exploit people's spirituality. I mean, like America is just crucible for this. I mean, it's the free market of religion in America. There's a theory. Rodney Stark has conceptualized why is, out of all of the wealthiest countries of the biggest superpowers, why is America getting more religious? Everyone else is secularizing. It's because they have a free market of religion. I mean, people are competing to get into people's pockets via their spiritual vigor. You know? So of course it's exploitable. And every solution creates more problems, right? So just because I've proposed a solution doesn't mean I'm also not Trojan horsing a problem in there too, you know? So. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, I wouldn't unless I had to. And I would define it in whatever context would serve my purpose in any given research program. Look, biologists can't agree what the definition of life is, you know, so that's a much bigger concept. Here I start with this model of reality thing, which is essentially a product of cultural learning. So the cultural evolutionary theorists in psychology would say culture is the cultural learning, like the process of culture, like the faculty of culture, you know, how we can learn from specific people, how we can keep this knowledge and these beliefs and norms and practices across generations. That's what perhaps cognitive scientists would call culture. But people studying other things would call culture different things. So I take ideas from Rappaport, who's an anthropologist, but he seems to be theoretically more of a sociologist because he's talking about these like structural aspects of culture, right? And he looks at this in a religious context in small-scale societies. So in those societies, religion, politics, culture, these sorts of things are like much more bounded than like secular society. So I borrow that. It's really what I mean. Some people would say it's just the beliefs, values, and practices of a group of people, which is fine. That's a fine definition to have if you're not going to investigate it if you're not going to investigate structural components, right? Because there's also a hierarchical aspect to culture and values and beliefs and morality and these sorts of things. So I use two ideas of culture. The model of reality, which is in the individual through cultural learning, and then I use the structural, sociological aspects of it, which may be less synonymous with culture as we know it and more just societal regulatory structures, you know. But you can define it in a bunch of different ways.
I just find it interested in how it differs from, you have this image of, on the one hand, we have cognitive beliefs, on the other hand, we have institutional norms.
Yeah.
And then your intervention was to bring in culture. And I'm curious, it sounds like you're saying culture is either cognitive beliefs or institutional
Right. I see what you're saying.
So is it both? Is it one? I would think maybe it's one acting on the other, or a feedback loop between the two, perhaps, between cognitive beliefs and institutional norms. So it seems like
Yeah, I think, okay, this is really tricky, and you're getting at a good point here, where I kind of like eat myself in the argument, because I pose as my foil something that strongly resembles what is my solution, right?
I'm not sure you do, but I'm interested in
Yeah,
the question of what you
yeah, so that's tricky. I mean, my interpretation of beliefs and attitudes in the social science model, like what you read in like survey research, like psychological research, seem to me a bit more superficial than something that can be considered like like someone's model of reality, or these sorts of more complex cultural beliefs. So, for example, like an attitude, I mean, an attitude can very quickly become like seriously cultural, right? So if you have an attitude about the environment, and then that attitude starts to constitute your identity, you know, it's like, I am what I believe about the environment. I am an environmentalist, you know, like we are environmentalists. Like you can see how it can move from something that's a bit more superficial, you know, climate change is bad, you know, I believe there's some of the research that's coming, into something that's a bit more like deep, which is my identity is intertwined with this idea. How I see groups of people, like, you know, this is the out-group now because of this attitude, right? So coming back to the model of reality, what is the family, what is strangers, what is predators, what's prey? You know, you can see that the attitude starts to bleed into those other things. So I think, in a very like broad and perhaps unsatisfying sense, I think culture is deeper and more complex than attitudes and beliefs, but I think it's a fuzzy category, right? Like, I don't know.
Do you think that spirituality is a innate thing? Is it like coming from you yourself, or is it coming from more like a human environment, like a cultural stuff that parents give to their siblings, or is it something that you have to activate? Like, what are your thoughts about like I kind of understand now you're bringing a CCP for topics, but how can really this come up?
Right. I don't think it's like an innate biological category. Like I wouldn't think there's an eco-spirituality gene or like complex of genes, right? So it's not like at that level. I think it's something that can be taught or instilled from parents and community and social context. I also think that what it has on its side is that it's something that can be discovered through experience, right? Through like the numinous. So it's grounding these ideas of transcendence and stuff with the experience in the here and now. You know, you go into nature and you have these like incredible experiences of awe or the sublime, you know. So it can be activated in that sense. I think it's both, yeah. I don't think it's biological though. Spirituality might be biological. I mean, I'm not totally sure about that, but it seems to be. There's, you know, relevant emotional markers and categories that seem to be distinct from other emotions which are biologically controlled, so I don't know. Yeah.
Then how, like, there are some people, like I have seen quite a few people, you know, who actually don't really never had a chance to really, and you know, be involved in nature. And those people don't necessarily appreciate nature as like it's the others.
Right.
Then like how would you if you are thinking that this will lead to a solution for the crisis, then how would you like deal with the real challenges, deal with those people?
I probably wouldn't. I mean, I don't know. Again, one thing you could do, like an intervention, if I were to imagine I'm an applied psychologist and I'm doing an intervention study, and I would put people in nature in instances of of spiritual experiences of nature that have been described to us. So like awe. So let's figure out what awe is in nature and then put people in those situations. This is if I was an applied psychologist. Or the sublime, like Edmund Burke, like, you know, like totally impressed with the overwhelming power of nature and this sort of fear but respect and admiration and this sort of like complex feeling of the sublime that's taken to be spiritual in his case. Well, let's figure out what experiences like that and put people in those situations. I think that's more practical than a lot of interventions that we come up with. It's probably has its benefits outside of just spirituality. I mean, there's tons of research of green spaces and time in nature and stuff being just generally beneficial for well-being and anxiety and that stuff. So I would do that, but I'm not sure. That's assuming this constitutes a legitimate solution, which I'm arguing, but I mean, I just started this research a few years ago, so I wouldn't die on that hill, but, you know, okay. Maybe last question, and then yeah. Yeah, Rappaport. Yeah, so he takes, he loved, Bateson was the cyberneticist, right? Yeah, so he just took that vocabulary and then did it to explain ritual and the making of humanity. No, I ran into, you know, I guess this is like a personal story. When I was in third year of my undergrad, I was in like a human evolution course, and I was like an angsty undergrad who took some like philosophy courses. So I was like, oh, Nietzsche and like, you know, the loss of religion and ritual and stuff. And so I wanted to take that idea and explore it. So I found Rappaport, like secondary lit on Rappaport. And that motivated me to come here and study religion. And then when I came here to study religion, my supervisor was like, let's study nature spirituality, like eco-spirituality seems like an interesting idea. And then it kind of came full circle that, you know, that would become useful in this case. Yeah. Okay, thank you. I won't keep you any longer. I appreciate that.